In World War I, shooting prisoners was not strategy. It was failure. Armies captured enemy soldiers to prove control, discipline, and superiority. So when German units began quietly choosing to shoot Scottish soldiers on sight, something had already gone very wrong. This wasn't hatred. It wasn't revenge. And it certainly wasn't because of kilts or bagpipes. It was a calculation, a grim one. German soldiers concluded that some enemies were more dangerous after surrender than before it. Scottish troops did not behave like prisoners were supposed to behave. They resisted restraint, attacked guards, refused submission, and fought even when disarmed. Capturing them meant diverting manpower, risking sudden violence, and losing control in the most fragile moments of combat. In modern warfare, unpredictability is more lethal than firepower. And Scottish regiments had become unpredictable in a way German doctrine could not contain. So, a forbidden logic emerged on the battlefield. If an enemy cannot be controlled, cannot be broken, and cannot be trusted to remain passive after surrender, then capture becomes the greater danger. That is how soldiers earn a name like ladies from hell, and that is how being taken alive stopped being an option. This story challenges what you think you know about war. Stay with it, because what happened next changed how soldiers were treated on both sides. World War I, capturing enemy soldiers was not an act of mercy. It was proof that a battle had gone according to plan. Prisoners meant control. They meant the enemy had been broken psychologically, not just physically. They meant discipline still existed on both sides of the line. Every major army entered the war with detailed procedures for taking prisoners. Disarm them, separate them, move them to the rear, guard them until transport arrived. The system assumed one thing above all else, that a surrendered soldier wanted to live. German doctrine relied on that assumption. So did British doctrine. So did everyone else fighting along the Western Front. The moment that assumption stopped being reliable, the entire system began to collapse. German soldiers did not fear prisoners because they were weak. They feared prisoners because guarding them required trust, time, and manpower, all in short supply at the front. A captured soldier had to be watched. He had to be restrained. He had to be moved through communication trenches while artillery still fell and counterattacks were still possible. Taking prisoners was safest when the battlefield was stable. It was most dangerous when fighting was still ongoing. And it was precisely in those moments, chaotic assaults, collapsing positions, close quarter fighting, that Scottish regiments became a problem no doctrine had prepared German units to solve. The danger was not ideological, it was practical. Scottish soldiers did not consistently behave like men who had accepted defeat. They did not always comply passively once disarmed. They resisted being searched. They resisted being restrained. They attempted escape immediately, violently, and without hesitation. For German units already stretched thin, already exhausted, already under threat of renewed attack, this created a dilemma with no clean solution. Every guard assigned to a prisoner was a rifle removed from the firing line. Every moment spent controlling a captive was a moment not spent preparing for the next assault. In theory, discipline demanded restraint. In practice, survival demanded speed. German frontline soldiers were not philosophers. They were men making decisions under extreme pressure, with incomplete information and limited time. What they learned through repeated encounters was simple and brutal. Some enemies did not become manageable once they surrendered. Scottish regiments had developed a reputation not for refusing to surrender, but for refusing to become harmless. This distinction mattered. Many elite units fought aggressively. Many units had reputations for toughness. But Scottish regiments were perceived as different because their aggression did not switch off when the tactical situation changed. They did not shift cleanly from attacker to captive. From the German perspective, this unpredictability was not heroic. It was destabilizing. Doctrine relies on predictable behavior. Once behavior becomes unpredictable, doctrine becomes liability. German officers could plan for firepower. They could plan for artillery. They could plan for conventional infantry tactics. What they could not plan for was an enemy whose behavior violated the unspoken rules that governed surrender. This erosion of trust did not happen overnight. It accumulated. One incident did not change policy. 10 incidents began to form a pattern. Patterns changed behavior. By late 1915 and into 1916, German frontline units had begun to internalize a grim lesson. Capturing Scottish soldiers during active combat created unacceptable risk. The response was not written in manuals. It did not appear in formal orders. It emerged informally, passed between units, reinforced by experience, and justified by necessity. If a surrendering enemy could not be safely controlled, then surrender lost its protective value. This logic did not arise from cruelty. It arose from calculation. In the chaos of trench warfare, the difference between a prisoner and a threat was measured in seconds. German soldiers were trained to eliminate threats. When surrender no longer reliably removed that threat, the distinction blurred. This is the point where moral clarity begins to fracture. The laws of war assume that both sides benefit from restraint. They assume that mercy is reciprocated. They assume that surrender is a contract. Contracts only function when both parties behave as expected. Scottish regiments, by reputation and repeated encounter, were perceived as violating that expectation, not because they were dishonorable, but because their culture emphasized resistance over submission, even in defeat. This cultural difference had battlefield consequences. German soldiers did not interpret Scottish behavior through anthropological curiosity. They interpreted it through the lens of risk, and risk, in trench warfare, was lethal. The decision to shoot rather than capture was not made in calm conditions. It was made when positions were unstable, when counterattacks were imminent, and when control was already slipping. It was a decision made by men who believed that hesitation would get them killed. Once that belief took hold, it spread. Fear travels faster than orders. And as fear spread, so did a new understanding among German units facing Scottish regiments. If you hesitate, you die. If you try to restrain them, you die. If you trust surrender too early, you die. This is how reputations are born in war. Not through slogans, not through propaganda, but through repeated encounters that teach soldiers what keeps them alive. By the time the phrase, "ladies from hell," entered common usage, it was no longer mockery. It was shorthand, a warning, a way of saying, "These are not men you handle the usual way." And once a group of soldiers is no longer handled the usual way, the war around them changes. The question is no longer who they were. The question becomes what they forced the enemy to become in response. That question, not kilts, not bagpipes, not myth, is where this story truly begins. The fear of Scottish regiments did not begin with kilts. It began with miscalculation. Before the war, German military intelligence prided itself on preparation. The Imperial Army studied its enemies meticulously: organization, doctrine, equipment, and regional differences. British forces were not viewed as a single, uniform opponent. They were categorized: English county regiments, Welsh battalions, Irish divisions, colonial troops, and, separately, the Scottish regiments. On paper, Scottish units were not assessed as uniquely dangerous. They were classified as conventional infantry with distinctive traditions. Their kilts were noted. Their bagpipes were mentioned. Their historical reputation was acknowledged and largely dismissed. German planners believed modern war had rendered tradition irrelevant. Machine guns had killed cavalry. Artillery had erased romantic charges. Industrial warfare rewarded firepower, logistics, and discipline, not symbolism. From that perspective, Scottish regiments appeared outdated rather than threatening. German assessments assumed that visible tradition existed for morale and ceremony, not combat effectiveness. Kilts were seen as cultural decoration, bagpipes as parade music, Highland identity as inherited mythology. These assumptions were logical. They were also catastrophically incomplete. What German doctrine failed to recognize was that Scottish regimental traditions were not superficial. They were functional. They shaped how soldiers interpreted fear, obedience, and survival. Most armies trained soldiers to preserve life while completing objectives. Scottish regiments trained soldiers to preserve reputation even at the cost of life. This distinction mattered more than German analysts understood. Doctrine assumes soldiers seek cover. Doctrine assumes soldiers respond to overwhelming fire by halting or withdrawing. Doctrine assumes that casualties eventually degrade offensive momentum. Scottish regiments did not always conform to those assumptions. Not because they were irrational, but because their internal incentives were different. Regimental identity in Scottish units was not abstract. It was personal. Men did not fight as anonymous soldiers. They fought as members of specific regiments with long memories and reputations that extended beyond the battlefield. Failure did not merely mean defeat. It meant dishonor. And dishonor, within that culture, was worse than death. German doctrine had no framework for opponents who accepted that logic. To German planners, discipline meant obedience to orders and preservation of force. To Scottish regiments, discipline also meant refusing to retreat, refusing to yield ground, and refusing to appear broken. These values translated into battlefield behavior that looked irrational to outsiders. Charges continued under fire. Units advanced where doctrine predicted collapse. Survivors pressed forward where others would consolidate or withdraw. From a German perspective, this behavior violated the expected relationship between firepower and movement. Machine guns were designed to stop infantry. Artillery was meant to shatter formations. Yet, Scottish regiments continued to close distance even after absorbing losses that would normally end an attack. German soldiers did not interpret this as courage alone. They interpreted it as instability. Unstable enemies are dangerous, not because they are stronger, but because they are harder to control. German doctrine emphasized predictability. Fire caused suppression. Suppression caused hesitation. Hesitation created opportunity. Scottish regiments disrupted that chain. When suppression did not reliably produce hesitation, German defensive calculations began to fail. Positions that should have held collapsed. Defensive fire that should have broken attacks merely thinned them. What remained reached the trenches. Once combat entered close quarters, German advantages diminished rapidly. Trench warfare was brutal, intimate, and chaotic. In that environment, psychological momentum mattered as much as firepower. Scottish soldiers, trained and culturally conditioned to press violence at close range, thrived there. German soldiers, facing opponents who advanced without visible regard for survival, experienced something more destabilizing than fear. They experienced loss of control. Loss of control is more corrosive to morale than loss of ground. A soldier who believes the situation is controllable can endure heavy casualties. A soldier who believes the enemy cannot be predicted begins to panic. German units began to associate Scottish regiments with loss of control, not because the Scots were supernatural, but because they violated expectations embedded deeply in German training. German intelligence had studied British equipment. It had studied tactics. It had studied order of battle. What it had not studied was identity. Identity does not appear in field manuals. It cannot be quantified easily. It resists analysis. Yet identity governs how soldiers interpret danger. Scottish regiments were not driven solely by orders. They were driven by the need to live up to inherited reputation. That reputation was not imposed from above. It was enforced internally. Men who faltered were remembered. Men who stood firm were celebrated. This internal pressure created units that did not break easily, even when logic suggested they should. German doctrine treated soldiers as components within a system. Scottish regimental culture treated soldiers as custodians of a legacy. The two models clashed violently. German planners assumed morale could be degraded by attrition. Scottish regiments accepted attrition as the price of success. German doctrine aimed to preserve combat power. Scottish doctrine aimed to complete the mission regardless of cost. These differences did not guarantee victory. Scottish units suffered enormous casualties, but they guaranteed something else. German units could not rely on standard escalation models when facing them. They could not predict when attacks would stop. They could not assume surrender would signal compliance. They could not trust that suppression would produce safety. Every assumption built into German defensive doctrine became uncertain. Uncertainty breeds fear. Fear accelerates decision-making. And accelerated decisions in war are rarely merciful. This is the context in which the label "Ladies from Hell" emerged. It was not a slur born of mockery. It was a linguistic attempt to describe something that did not fit established categories. Men who wore skirts. Men who charged machine guns. men who did not behave like defeated soldiers. The label simplified complexity into warning, a way of saying, these troops do not respond the way others do. Once that understanding spread, it reshaped battlefield behavior. German units facing Scottish regiments adjusted not because they hated them, but because their doctrine no longer worked against them. And when doctrine fails, soldiers revert to instinct. Instinct prioritizes survival. By the end of Act 2, the picture is clear. German forces did not decide to shoot Scottish soldiers because of tradition or appearance. They did so because their systems, intellectual, tactical, and psychological, could not reliably manage them. The enemy was not just attacking German positions, it was attacking German assumptions. And assumptions, once broken, are replaced by fear. What that fear produced on the battlefield and how it hardened into unofficial rules is where this story goes next. Now, one fact is clear. German forces were not reacting to how Scottish soldiers looked. They were reacting to how Scottish soldiers behaved, especially when the situation changed. Most soldiers are trained for combat. Far fewer are trained for what happens after combat appears to end. Surrender is not just a gesture. It is a psychological transition. A soldier who surrenders is expected to stop being dangerous. That expectation underpins every law of war, every prisoner protocol, every assumption about restraint. Scottish regiments repeatedly violated that expectation, not deliberately, not ideologically, but structurally. To understand why, we need to examine how these soldiers understood identity and how identity shaped behavior under extreme stress. For many armies, identity is national. A uniform represents the state. For Scottish regiments, identity was regimental first. Men did not fight primarily as British soldiers. They fought as members of specific units with specific histories. Those histories were not abstract. They were retold constantly in training, in barracks, in ritual, and in memory. Every regiment carried a narrative of who they were supposed to be, and that narrative did not include passive submission. Scottish regimental culture emphasized aggression, initiative, and personal responsibility for violence. This mattered most in moments where formal command structures broke down. Trench warfare created countless such moments. Artillery disrupted communications. Officers were killed. Orders became unclear. In those gaps, soldiers defaulted to identity. For many units, that meant caution. For Scottish regiments, it meant continuation. They continued advancing when command faltered. They continued fighting when formations dissolved. They continued resisting when surrender might have been expected. This behavior was not reckless. It was conditioned. Scottish soldiers were raised in a military culture that framed retreat as shameful and submission as dishonor. To stop fighting was not neutral. It was negative. This did not mean Scottish soldiers never surrendered. They did. But surrender, for them, was not the end of resistance. It was often treated as a temporary state, a pause imposed by circumstance, not an acceptance of defeat. From the German perspective, this was deeply dangerous. A prisoner who sees surrender as conditional is not a prisoner. He is a threat waiting for opportunity. German soldiers began to notice patterns. Captured Scottish soldiers resisted being searched more violently than others. They resisted being bound. They attempted escape immediately, even when escape was irrational. They attacked guards with hands, with tools, with anything available. These incidents were not isolated. They were frequent enough to shape expectation. Expectation shapes behavior faster than doctrine. German guards became tense when handling Scottish prisoners. Tense guards react faster. Fast reactions escalate violence. The psychological gap widened. German soldiers began to assume that Scottish prisoners would resist. Scottish prisoners, sensing hostility, became more aggressive. The cycle reinforced itself. At this point, the question was no longer morality. It was control. Guarding prisoners requires control over time, space, and manpower. In active combat zones, German units had none of those in surplus. Prisoners had to be moved through trenches, already congested with wounded, ammunition, and reinforcements. Every additional prisoner increased vulnerability. For most captured soldiers, this risk was manageable. For Scottish soldiers, it often was not. The German conclusion was not written in policy language. It was internalized as instinct. Do not turn your back. Do not assume compliance. Do not hesitate. When instinct replaces protocol, outcomes harden. This is where the phrase, more dangerous after surrender, becomes meaningful. It does not mean Scottish soldiers were superhuman. It means they did not perform the psychological surrender that German soldiers relied on to feel safe. Most prisoners signal submission clearly. They lower eyes. They obey immediately. They seek survival. Scottish prisoners, by reputation, did not always do this. They remained alert. They remained defiant. They remained aggressive when opportunity appeared. Behavior made sense within their own cultural framework, but it terrified those tasked with controlling them. Fear does not require exaggeration. It requires uncertainty. German soldiers could tolerate dangerous enemies in front of them. They could not tolerate dangerous enemies behind them. This distinction explains much of what followed. A captured soldier in front is a target. A captured soldier behind is a liability. Once Scottish soldiers became associated with liability rather than control, the logic shifted. German soldiers did not believe they could safely process them under fire, so they shortened the process. This is the moment where unofficial practices began to replace official expectations. Not because soldiers wanted brutality, but because they wanted predictability. Predictability had disappeared, and without predictability, survival demanded preemption. The identity of Scottish regiments also amplified this effect. These were not anonymous troops. They were known units. Known units carry known reputations. Once a reputation forms, individual behavior no longer matters. German soldiers did not ask whether this specific prisoner would resist. They assumed he would. Assumption simplifies decision-making. Simplified decisions are faster. Faster decisions are harsher. This is how reputations kill. Not through hatred, through compression of judgment. Scottish regiments became compressed into a single category in the German mind: uncontrollable. Once placed there, individual mercy became irrelevant. This is the dark mathematics of war. Complexity is reduced to probability. Probability is reduced to risk. Risk is reduced to elimination. This process did not begin with kilts. It began with repeated encounters that trained German soldiers to associate Scottish surrender with danger. By the time the phrase, "ladies from hell," circulated, it carried this meaning implicitly. It was not about gender. It was not about mockery. It was about warning. These soldiers do not stop. Not when charged. Not when wounded. Not even when captured. From the German point of view, this meant one thing. If they cannot be turned off, they must be removed. This is the point where battlefield logic overtakes law, where survival calculations override written codes, where soldiers stop asking what is permitted and ask only what keeps them alive. The consequences of that shift were brutal, and they did not remain isolated. They spread. Once a single unit adopted a practice that appeared to improve survival, others followed. Fear is contagious. So is precedent. By the time German units widely expected Scottish prisoners to resist violently, the decision to shoot on sight was no longer shocking. It was rationalized, not as cruelty, but as prevention. This is how war strips away nuance, how identity becomes threat, how reputation becomes sentence, and how soldiers who refuse to switch off even in defeat force their enemies to abandon restraint entirely. The next question is unavoidable. If Scottish soldiers were treated differently after capture, how did that affect how they fought before capture? And what happens to warfare when both sides begin to assume that surrender may no longer protect them? That is where this story turns even darker. Fear is often misunderstood in war. It is usually described as weakness, something to be overcome, suppressed, or eliminated. But fear does not disappear under fire. It adapts. And once fear adapts, it becomes a weapon. German soldiers did not fear Scottish regiments because they were unbeatable. They feared them because they were destabilizing. Most battlefield fear is predictable. Artillery causes fear. Machine guns cause fear. Encirclement causes fear. These fears can be managed. They fit inside doctrine. What German forces encountered with Scottish regiments was different. It was not fear of death. It was fear of losing control. Control over distance. Control over tempo. Control over the sequence of events that doctrine promised would unfold. Scottish regiments disrupted that sequence. They advanced when expected to halt. They closed distance when suppression should have pinned them. They continued violence when surrender should have ended it. This created a form of psychological pressure that German doctrine had no answer for. German defensive theory relied on escalation. Fire would stop movement. Casualties would stop attacks. Time would degrade morale. Scottish assaults compressed time. They shortened the window in which German soldiers could think, adjust, and respond. And when thinking time disappears, instinct takes over. Instinct is rarely subtle. The visual impact of Scottish soldiers played a critical role in this process. German soldiers expected modern enemies to look modern. Uniforms were supposed to signal functionality, concealment, and efficiency. Scottish kilts violated that expectation. They were immediately recognizable, immediately incongruent, immediately unsettling. The human brain reacts strongly to contradiction. When something looks wrong, attention spikes. When that something then behaves aggressively, fear intensifies. Kilts created cognitive dissonance. Men in skirts should not advance calmly into machine gun fire. When they did, German soldiers struggled to process what they were seeing. This processing delay mattered. Fear increases reaction time. Reaction time reduces accuracy. Reduced accuracy increases panic. Scottish regiments did not need supernatural courage to exploit this effect. They only needed to keep moving. Bagpipes amplified the disruption. German soldiers were familiar with military music. Marches were orderly. Rhythms were predictable. Bagpipes were neither. They produced a continuous, intrusive sound that did not align with the expected auditory environment of battle. The sound carried over artillery noise. It cut through confusion. It could not be ignored, and it arrived before the men did. This mattered psychologically. Fear intensifies when it arrives before the threat. German soldiers who heard bagpipes knew what followed. They did not associate the sound with ceremony. They associated it with impending close combat. Once that association formed, the sound itself became a trigger. Anticipatory fear is often worse than immediate danger. It drains concentration. It fragments unit cohesion. It accelerates exhaustion. German attempts to neutralize this effect by targeting pipers only reinforced it. Killing pipers did not stop the sound. Other pipers took their place. The implication was clear. The sound would continue until the assault ended one way or another. This persistence contributed to the perception that Scottish regiments could not be psychologically suppressed. They did not respond to pain, loss, or intimidation the way Doctrine predicted. German soldiers began to describe Scottish assaults not in tactical terms, but emotional ones. Unsettling, relentless, inhuman. These descriptions were not exaggerations. They were attempts to explain loss of control. Once a unit loses confidence in its ability to manage an enemy, fear multiplies. Fear does not remain individual. It spreads. One shaken unit communicates anxiety to adjacent units. Rumors travel faster than orders. Stories of Scottish assaults circulated widely along the front. These stories became simplified. Details were stripped away. What remained was warning. They do not stop. They do not retreat. They do not surrender cleanly. This simplification hardened perception. Many German soldiers faced Scottish regiments for the first time. They already believed they knew what would happen. Expectation shapes experience. Fear becomes self-fulfilling. German soldiers entered combat already tense. Tense soldiers make mistakes. Mistakes reinforce fear. The cycle accelerated. This psychological pressure affected decision-making at every level. Junior officers hesitated longer. Machine gunners fired too early or too late. Units broke sooner than Doctrine predicted. Not because Scottish regiments were tactically superior in every case, but because fear had shifted the balance before contact. Fear does not require superiority. It requires credibility. Scottish regiments earned that credibility through consistency. They behaved in ways that aligned with their reputation, often enough that German soldiers trusted the reputation more than their own expectations. At that point, the fear became operational. German units adjusted tactics not based on formal doctrine, but on avoidance. They withdrew earlier. They abandoned positions sooner. They prioritized escape over resistance. This is not cowardice. It is adaptation. But adaptation carries consequences. Once German soldiers began to view Scottish assaults as inherently uncontrollable, the threshold for extreme measures lowered. When fear dominates, restraint feels like risk. Restraint requires confidence. Confidence requires predictability. Scottish regiments destroyed predictability. The name Ladies from Hell encapsulated this psychological collapse. It combined mockery with terror. It reduced a complex enemy into a symbolic threat. Symbols travel faster than analysis. A name can carry more weight than orders. Once the name spread, behavior followed. German soldiers did not need explicit instructions. They adjusted instinctively. If an enemy inspires enough fear, soldiers stop asking what is permitted. They ask what is necessary. This is the moment when fear becomes weaponized, not by the side experiencing it, but by the side causing it. Scottish regiments did not set out to terrify. They set out to attack aggressively and consistently. Fear was a byproduct. But that byproduct had strategic consequences. It eroded German willingness to fight certain battles. It reshaped defensive priorities. It altered the moral calculus of capture and surrender. Fear does not care about legality. It cares about survival. And once survival becomes the dominant concern, extreme actions become acceptable. The battlefield no longer rewards discipline alone. It rewards decisiveness. This is where the logic of shoot on sight takes root, not as ideology, not as hatred, but as an extension of fear that has outgrown control. When fear becomes normalized, killing feels preventative. When killing feels preventative, restraint disappears. This transformation did not happen everywhere, but where it did, it changed the nature of combat entirely. The next stage of this story is not about how Germans feared Scottish soldiers. It is about how that fear fed back into Scottish behavior and escalated the violence even further. Once both sides began to assume that surrender no longer guaranteed survival, the war entered a darker phase. One where fear, reputation, and expectation locked soldiers into a cycle that neither side could easily escape. That is where Act 5 begins. By the time fear had fully taken root, the battlefield had changed its rules. Not officially, not on paper, but in practice. The laws of war assume that surrender creates safety. They assume that once a soldier stops fighting, violence stops with him. That assumption only holds if both sides believe it. Along sectors where Scottish regiments were involved, that belief began to collapse. German soldiers no longer trusted surrender to neutralize danger. Scottish soldiers no longer trusted surrender to ensure survival. Once that mutual trust eroded, the battlefield entered a self-reinforcing cycle. Violence accelerated not because either side wanted it, but because neither side believed restraint would be reciprocated. For German units, the logic was brutally simple. A surrendering Scottish soldier could still be dangerous. He could resist. He could attack. He could escape and rejoin the fight. Capturing him required time, guards, and attention, all scarce under fire. In unstable combat zones, those costs felt unacceptable. So, German soldiers began to preempt the problem. They shortened the decision-making window. Instead of asking whether a surrender was genuine, they assumed it was risky. Instead of preparing to restrain, they prepared to eliminate. This shift did not require explicit orders. It required precedent. Once a few units acted this way and survived, others followed. Fear validates behavior faster than doctrine ever could. Scottish soldiers sensed this change. They were not unaware of their reputation. They knew German units feared them. They knew capture was increasingly dangerous. This knowledge reshaped their own behavior. If surrender no longer guaranteed survival, then surrender lost its meaning. A soldier who believes he will be killed regardless has no incentive to comply. He fights harder. He resists longer. He takes greater risks. Scottish regiments were already conditioned to aggressive action. Now aggression felt necessary. This is how reputations become traps. Once an enemy expects you to fight to the death, you are forced to live up to that expectation or die anyway. Scottish soldiers did not become more violent because they wanted to. They became more violent because restraint no longer protected them. This feedback loop intensified combat. German soldiers, expecting resistance, reacted faster and harsher. Scottish soldiers, expecting execution, resisted more fiercely. Each side read the other's behavior as confirmation. Violence justified violence. At this stage, the war was no longer governed by abstract rules. It was governed by anticipation. Anticipation of betrayal. Anticipation of sudden attack. Anticipation of death. Close quarters combat magnified these dynamics. Trenches offered little space to de-escalate. Encounters were sudden. Distances were short. Decisions were immediate. There was no time for negotiation. A raised rifle could be interpreted as surrender or as deception. Hesitation could be fatal. Under these conditions, killing became a form of certainty. Certainty is comforting in chaos. The result was a battlefield environment where taking prisoners became increasingly rare during assaults. This was not unique to Scottish regiments. Elite assault units across the war experienced similar dynamics. But Scottish regiments encountered it more consistently because of their reputation. Reputation acts like gravity. It bends behavior toward its center. German units facing Scottish assaults did not expect mercy. Scottish units did not expect it either. Once both sides internalized this expectation, escalation was inevitable. The phrase, "shot on sight," did not mean indiscriminate killing everywhere. It meant something more specific and more disturbing. It meant that in moments of instability, when control was uncertain, restraint was abandoned first. Prisoners might still be taken in rear areas. They might still be taken after positions were fully secured, but during active fighting, the default shifted. Surrender no longer paused violence. It became part of it. This had consequences beyond immediate casualties. It changed how soldiers thought about combat. When surrender loses protective power, soldiers stop thinking in terms of phases. There is no attack phase and capture phase. There is only survival. This mindset compresses moral space. Actions that would normally require justification become automatic. Once automatic, they spread. German soldiers shared warnings. Scottish soldiers shared stories. Each reinforced the other's expectations. Fear hardened into doctrine at the informal level. This is how unofficial rules replace official ones. Not through command, through experience. By this point, the war between German units and Scottish regiments had entered a different category. It was no longer just about holding ground. It was about avoiding annihilation. Avoidance strategies emerged. German units withdrew earlier when facing Scottish assaults. They prioritized escape over stubborn defense. This reduced immediate losses but reinforced Scottish reputation. Every withdrawal became proof. Every abandoned position confirmed the narrative. Scottish soldiers interpreted these withdrawals as validation of their methods. Aggression worked. Fear worked. The cycle deepened. This is the cruel paradox of elite status in war. Effectiveness breeds fear. Fear breeds escalation. Escalation increases cost. Scottish regiments paid that cost in casualties. Their willingness to fight without expectation of mercy came at enormous human expense. But it also locked them into a role they could not easily escape. Once labeled as troops who could not be safely captured, they were denied the possibility of safe surrender. That denial shaped every engagement. The battlefield became binary: win decisively or be destroyed. This binary thinking strips away nuance. It leaves no room for hesitation or compromise. From the German perspective, this environment justified extreme measures. From the Scottish perspective, it demanded relentless aggression. Neither side believed the other would show restraint. Both sides believed hesitation meant death. At that point, the laws of war became theoretical. Reality operated on fear. Fear does not negotiate. It escalates. The tragedy is that this escalation was not driven by hatred. It was driven by rational fear under irrational conditions. Each side responded logically to what it believed about the other, and those beliefs, once formed, were almost impossible to dislodge. This is how wars become more brutal without anyone formally deciding they should. Not through ideology, through expectation. By the end of this phase, the nickname "Ladies from Hell" carried a final meaning. It no longer described appearance. It no longer described mockery. It described inevitability. If Scottish regiments attacked, the fight would be costly. If they reached the trenches, it would be lethal. If they were captured, it would be dangerous. For both sides, this mutual recognition sealed the cycle. Once surrender stopped protecting anyone, combat ceased to have breaks. The question that remains is unavoidable. What happens when a unit accepts this reality and continues to fight anyway? What kind of soldiers choose fear over safety, reputation over survival? And why did this mindset persist into the next war, long after the trenches were gone? That is where this story reaches its final meaning. Final years of the war, the pattern was no longer accidental. Scottish regiments had become something rare in industrial warfare, units whose identity mattered as much as their weapons. They did not fight because they were ordered to. They fought because retreat threatened something worse than death. Honor, reputation, continuity. These are not abstract concepts in war. They are behavioral forces. A soldier who fights to survive calculates risk. A soldier who fights to preserve identity accepts it. Scottish regiments had crossed that threshold. They were no longer primarily motivated by safety. They were motivated by who they were expected to be. This expectation did not come from propaganda posters or speeches. It came from history. Each regiment carried a memory of past actions, victories, sacrifices, losses that shaped how current soldiers understood their role. To retreat was not simply tactical withdrawal. It was betrayal of those memories. To surrender was not merely survival. It was erosion of legacy. This mentality produced soldiers who did not disengage easily. German forces recognized this sometimes earlier than British command did. German military analysis after the war repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Scottish units were not technically superior. They did not possess better weapons. They did not enjoy decisive numerical advantages. What they possessed was psychological cohesion. Cohesion built not on ideology or coercion, but on pride. That made them dangerous. Because pride cannot be suppressed with artillery. It cannot be bombed out of trenches. It cannot be exhausted the way supply lines can. You either break it completely or you face it again. German commanders learned that breaking Scottish regiments psychologically was extremely difficult. Even when positions held, even when casualties mounted, the units continued to attack. And once they attacked, they did not disengage cleanly. This forced German forces into a cost-benefit calculation that few armies like to admit. Was holding this position worth facing that kind of enemy? Often, the answer was no. Withdrawal became the rational choice, not because the Scots were unbeatable, but because the cost of stopping them was too high. This is the highest compliment one army can pay another. To avoid battle, because victory is not worth the price. This reputation did not end with World War I. It carried forward. In World War II, Scottish regiments no longer wore kilts into most combat zones. Modern warfare had changed, but identity had not. Bagpipes still played. Aggressive doctrine still defined their role. Reputation still preceded them. German units facing Scottish divisions in North Africa and Europe rediscovered what their fathers had learned. These troops did not retreat easily. They did not disengage once committed. They did not respond predictably to pressure. German assessments from the Second World War described Scottish units as reliable assault infantry, dangerous not because of fanaticism, but because of professionalism combined with pride. They fought because they believed it was their role to break positions others could not. This continuity across wars is important. It shows that the behavior examined in this story was not an anomaly. It was structural. Scottish regiments had built a culture that rewarded endurance under extreme cost. That culture produced battlefield effectiveness. It also produced vulnerability. The cost of such identity is high. Scottish units suffered disproportionate casualties across both wars. Entire generations were consumed to maintain reputations forged centuries earlier. But those reputations mattered. They altered enemy behavior. They shaped tactical decisions. They influenced outcomes beyond individual battles. This brings us back to the most uncomfortable question. Why would soldiers accept a reputation that led enemies to shoot them on sight? Why choose fear over safety? The answer is not simple. For Scottish regiments, safety was never guaranteed. They fought as assault troops. They were sent into the hardest sectors, They were expected to succeed where others had failed. Given that role, the marginal benefit of mercy was limited. What they gained instead was control over how they were perceived. Feared soldiers dictate the terms of engagement. Feared soldiers are avoided. Feared soldiers cause withdrawals. Feared soldiers shape the battlefield before they arrive. In this calculus, fear becomes a strategic asset. It reduces resistance. It shortens battles. It compensates for lack of material advantage. Scottish regiments understood this intuitively. They leaned into their reputation, not because they wanted cruelty, but because they wanted effectiveness. The grim truth of war is that effectiveness often carries moral cost. Being feared makes surrender dangerous. Being respected makes restraint less likely. Elite status narrows options. Once labeled as troops who do not stop, you cannot stop, even if you want to. The enemy will not believe you. This is the trap of reputation. Scottish soldiers lived with it. They understood that their identity made capture unlikely, so they fought accordingly. This choice was not universal. It was not made consciously by every soldier, but it was reinforced collectively. Culture creates momentum. Momentum becomes destiny. The Germans did not invent the ladies from hell. In quote, they named something they could not control. The name was not meant to flatter. It was meant to warn. Men who wear skirts. Men who charge without hesitation. Men who do not become harmless when disarmed. Men who force you to choose between retreat and annihilation. That is what made them dangerous. Not mystic, not myth, not costume, but refusal. Refusal to behave the way war expects. Refusal to disengage when logic says stop. Refusal to surrender psychologically, even when surrender physically. This refusal reshaped encounters on the Western Front. It eroded the protective power of surrender. It accelerated brutality. It hardened both sides. But it also reveals a deeper truth about warfare. Wars are not decided only by weapons or numbers. They are decided by what soldiers believe will happen next. If soldiers believe surrender protects them, wars slow down. If soldiers believe surrender kills them, wars spiral. Scottish regiments existed on the edge of that spiral. They paid for it with blood. They earned something else in return: respect from enemies who survived them, fear from those who did not. The Germans shot them on sight not because they were cruel, but because they believed they had no safer option. That belief was shaped by repeated encounters with men who refused to stop fighting when the rules said they should. This is not a story about heroes or villains. It is a story about what happens when identity outpaces doctrine, when reputation outlives restraint, when soldiers choose to be feared rather than spared. The ladies wore skirts. The ladies charged machine guns. The ladies forced armies to abandon assumptions. And hell, as their enemies learned, was not a place. It was a reputation. War is not only decided by weapons, it is decided by what soldiers believe will happen next. If you want more stories that examine war beyond the battlefield, subscribe.